Welcome to FS-ISAC's podcast, Cyber Today. I'm Elizabeth Heathfield, Chief Communications Officer at FS-ISAC. Another day, another new cyber regulation for financial firms. Regulation is no one's favorite topic, except perhaps for Erez Liebermann, partner at law firm Debevoise Plimpton, former Chief Counsel for Cybersecurity and Privacy at Prudential, and also a former federal prosecutor of cybercrime. Erez helps his clients, many of whom are our members, navigate the increasing complexity of cyber regulation around the world, and regularly advises boards and C-suites on both business strategy and legal and regulatory issues. I thought he'd be a good person to talk to about the key provisions and a whole bunch of upcoming cyber regulation and how firms should think about integrating these new requirements into their cyber and resilience programs. Thanks for being here, Erez. All right, let's start with the big picture. So what have you seen over the last couple of years in terms of increased cyber regulation on financial firms? What are the big trends? And how should CISOs be thinking about what seems to be a barrage of regulation that's coming from all sides?
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. There's certainly a barrage of regulation like nothing I've seen in the cyber space ever. And it's, of course, new, the whole cyberspace for regulation. So not having seen it ever is not a huge statement, but it just shows the trend we're now truly seeing. The regulations are coming from all directions, right? It's not just one particular regulator. We started with the New York Department of Financial Services years ago, and of course the feds put out guidance, but now we've got the SEC, the New York Department of Financial Services, we've got the government putting out notification regulations, and overseas they were way behind on cyber. I think most of the rest of the world thought of cyber as privacy. And when they talked about cyber regulations, they were talking about a line or two in privacy regulations. But that has come and gone. The rest of the world has caught up, and they are putting out some very significant regulation, like the DORA Act out in Europe. And we're seeing a true trend, right? Regulators are now bringing cyber well outside of the cyber realm or the information security realm, and they want to see management and the board invested, involved, and viewing cyber as one of the key risk areas for a company. And that's consistent with most risk metrics. A lot of companies will list cybersecurity as one of their top 3 operational risks, and even some of them will list it as a regulatory risk, top 3 regulatory risk. So of course that should get taken outside of simply a discussion in the CISO circles and the information security world and into risk management and the board. I think we see major trends, right? So we see, number one, as I mentioned, we see risk management. We want operational risk, and we want the C-suite to make sure that they've got an overview of the risks a company faces and what the company's road plan is to address those risks. So risk management. Along with that comes governance, and good governance comes only after you understand the risks and risk management. Credit to the regulators for understanding that you've got to build both together, therefore. And we're seeing a lot more about governance, board's role, C-suite's role. We'll talk about that. Certainly seeing an abundance of incident reporting regulations. Many would argue, like myself, that there's too much incident reporting regulation. And what are the regulators going to be doing with all this reporting? And why is it beneficial to have all this? And then I think we're definitely seeing third-party risk management, an increase in that visibility and the regulation overseeing that. To the credit of the financial services regulators, they've been out there upping the game on cybersecurity, and so have CISOs and companies. And so where that leads us is that the weak link is often the third party, and the regulators want to see that stepped up. So I'd say those are key trends right now.
All right, let's get into some of the details on the individual regulations. So let's talk about the main ones coming down the pike for financial firms in the U.S., and then we can go overseas as well.
Yeah. So let's start with the one that I think kind of started it all, which is the New York Department of Financial Services, Part 500. In 2017, New York Part 500 came out and really was the first true cyber regulation, certainly outside of just banks, but affecting other financial services institutions, and laid the groundwork for the rest and the new world of cyber regulations. There's not a new New York Department Part 500, but there is a major overhaul. These regulations are going to change the way oversight is. So clearly a change in how much oversight we can expect from the board. They're going to change the way reporting is with new reporting regulations, and then some key critical technology elements that are coming into this. So for example, and I give credit again, New York Department of Financial Services, one of the underpinnings of cybersecurity is a risk assessment. In the past, we heard the department talk about how the risk assessments that are the linchpin of a risk-based regulation are cookie cutters. So that they've said that you could take the name of one financial service institution, put it on a risk assessment that another institution provided, and it would look almost exactly the same, which is a pretty fair indication that that's not a strong risk assessment. It's just a kind of a global risk review, and doesn't help a company truly tailor how they need to reply or respond to a risk-based regulation. So the department has come out and said, we want much more robust risk assessments. And I think that that's actually good, to the extent that there are financial service institutions that are not doing a robust risk assessment. Having one is very helpful, and this can encourage that. Credit to the department on that. They also put in a suggestion of every 3 years it should be externally led. We'll see how that survives the amendment process, but an interesting one because it gives some good benchmarking to the board and your senior management when that risk assessment is externally led. The reason that's had some pushback is because there's also a requirement for an external audit coming out of the department's new proposed amendments. And so how many external reviews does a company really need, plus all the reviews coming from examinations? So we'll see where that leads us overall, but there's a clear sense that the department wants to see financial services institutions having some externally minded view of where they stand and some benchmarking. And I do think even when you've got tremendous expertise in the financial services world, and wow, do we have financial service expertise, it's still helpful to have that benchmarking, and having it externally is helpful for that, right? The visibility across other financial services. Both the New York Department of Financial Services and the SEC have come out strong on boards. And so the SEC has proposed a number of regulations. The first that we're expecting is one for all publicly traded companies. And they have suggested that the publicly traded companies will have to disclose material incidents within 4 days, and we'll certainly talk more about that, and also disclose whether there's any cyber expertise on the board. And the Department of Financial Services from New York has also talked about that. So that's a critical thing to think through. And both of them are really driving towards board expertise and what the requirements might be around that. So we'll talk more about the board and board expertise, but both New York and the SEC are either requiring it or requiring some sort of substitute board expertise. The SEC's got the 4 days requirement with respect to reporting publicly. It's one of the first requirements for a cyber incident to be reported publicly, and that's gotten tremendous amount of pushback from everyone, really from everyone. And the reason is because it's 4 days from determining that an incident is material. We can talk about what materiality means, right? A huge question for sure, but once you determine that it's material, and they know that we can just bury our head in the sand, so they said you're not allowed to do that. So once you determine it's material, you come out, and maybe that some people will hear that say, well, big deal. We've seen other regulations, including New York Department of Financial Services, GDPR, and many of the GDPR clones around the world require 72-hour notification, except that 72 hours is to a regulator and is not necessarily going to be public, and this will be a public notification. It's a very, very tough stance with no current exception for working with law enforcement or regulators and a delay based on that. That's why I say it's received pushback from everyone. I've heard other government institutions in the U.S. push back against this notion that the SEC has put out. The SEC, aside from the regulation with respect to the publicly traded companies, has issued other regulations, proposed regulations. Many of them are for boards or for or for financial services advisors and management companies, financial management companies. And with respect to those, there are a number of rules. For example, updated safeguards rule, registered investment advisor rules, and others, which talk about the extent to which there will be additional risk management by senior members of these institutions to oversee cyber, to understand what's going on in the world of cyber, and then additional reporting requirements. And as we talk later, I think we'll get to harmonization. Even within the SEC's own regulations, we could use some harmonization, let alone with respect to the SEC, DFS, European regulations, and others. So I think that there's a lot to be said for what we need to do on that, but risk management is certainly something the SEC is looking at as extremely important. And it is, right? New York DFS also looking at that. And I think that's where we can bring in the DORA, right? The Operational Resilience Act in Europe, also extremely strong on risk management and reporting. I think they're carrying that mantle to Europe, and I credit them with catching up to the U.S.-based regulations with the DORA coming out. It's in effect, but there's a couple of years now to start complying with that. Those companies that have not had to deal with DFS or other similar regulations might have some catching up to do. But we've been talking about DORA now probably for 2 years. So the 2-year implementation period gives us some time.
So let's talk about the incident reporting first and get into that a little bit more. It does seem to me that 4 days from having a material incident to be public feels like it's fast if you don't know what if you haven't figured out what you can say. But let's just talk about, the purpose, and assuming that some level of incident reporting is pushed through, whether it's 4 days or a week or whatever, what does that actually mean for cyber teams? And, do they need to reorganize their incident response processes to accommodate this?
I think the answer is yes. And that's what they are trying to drive. Now, I don't agree with a 4-day reporting process, not that anyone's asking me, but I have had a number of opportunities to be on panels with David Hirsch, who is the head of the SEC's crypto and cyber enforcement section. David is nothing but, if not, reasonable on this. He speaks about this in the plainest terms, and he says, look, how many publicly traded companies have you seen with data breaches, and how many disclosure enforcement actions have come out of the SEC? And he's like, so little. And he says the guidance about having to put out disclosures has been out there for a long time. It may not have said 4 days, but it's been out there for a long time. This is codifying it and giving the 4-day time limit, and yet so few enforcement actions. So strikes a pretty reasonable tone that this is not about to be the floodgates are opening, and we understand that the disclosures are in place. But I think companies absolutely need to think through this issue. The worst kind of enforcement action may be the one against the First American title, when they were informed by Brian Krebs a couple of years ago that they had essentially access to mortgage documents and underlying documents available to anyone who scrolled through or logged through the URL and changed the URL. And it turns out that they then put out a 8K a few days later. It was a Memorial Day weekend, I believe, and so they put it out on the next available business day, and they said that they have now been informed about it and immediately fixed this issue. The problem was that they actually knew about it a few months earlier. So it was May when they put this out, and they knew about it internally in January. They made a mistake. It was misdiagnosed or mislabeled as a low or medium vulnerability when it was obviously a critical vulnerability. And so they didn't address that vulnerability internally. And even worse, when it got to the point of putting out an 8K, they said that they hadn't known about this, and they did. What it really demonstrated, and the SEC didn't say, by the way, the senior executives lied about this. The SEC said the senior executives didn't know what was going on within the organization in order to make a decision about disclosure. And that's critical. So they're sending a clear message. It's not, you can't just say, I didn't know, and so I was telling the truth. They said that happened here. They didn't know, and they were telling the truth, but they should have known. They wanted to see that escalation. They wanted to make sure that all the parts of the organization are talking about that. And I think that that's the lesson we need to take out of the new rules. Also from the New York Department of Financial Services, CIRCIA has new rules with respect to disclosure. The banks, of course, have a 36-hour disclosure rule from the OCC and other federal regulators. And so it's a question of how do we get the escalation and where do we do that? And I think that that's an extremely, extremely fine balance. The moment you start escalating too much, it becomes white noise and no one listens to it. And if you escalate too little, you might miss one of these incidents. To me, that's always been the toughest task in cyber. It's not what to do when you realize you've got a major incident. We practice that. We do tabletop exercises. We all work. It's, are you sitting on the major incident today and you don't realize that because you're just seeing the tip of the iceberg? So I think that's a real issue.
Which is related to the materiality problem, right? Like, is it defined in these rules what is material? How do you know? Because obviously then the incentive would be to not call something material until the last possible second so that you have the time to deal with it before it hits the public.
Great question. So let's start with a view on the SEC's statement here that supports the SEC in the following way. Many incidents, and I work incidents every day, right? That's part of my practice, or a big part of my practice. And many of them, you really don't know if it's material in the early days of an incident. So it's not that you need to immediately inform or put out an 8K before you've had a chance to get your arms around things. You just don't know. Even in a ransomware incident, you don't know if it's actually going to shut down your services. And if it did shut down some of your services, you believe in the first days, maybe I'll be able to recover them through backups or pay a ransomware actor in the next day or two, and I'm going to be fine. And this will not have a material impact on my operation. And indeed, in most of the stories that we hear about ransomware, the company either restored from backup or restored by paying and got back up and did not actually have a dip in their stock that was significant or material. And so I think that there are many cyber incidents that are not material, and certainly that you do not hear about them early on. But it is definitely front of mind or top of mind for companies as they're dealing with incidents. The SEC has not actually put out helpful guidance on this. Instead, the SEC has said that you should determine materiality based on their past examples in the cyber realm and in other examples and cases that have talked about materiality. I've heard someone analogize that to telling their kids that they're not going to tell them when they're due home or a curfew, but they will have to learn based on the punishments they receive on when they got home as to whether they were right in their curfew or not right in their curfew. I hate to say that this is similar, but it is a little similar. It would be helpful to have more guidance on this. And so companies, we're not going to get that guidance. I don't think we're going to get that guidance unless we get 10, 15, 20 more enforcement actions. And I think we're all hoping not to see all those enforcement actions against companies. So what should companies really do for materiality? The SEC has told us to look at these other opinions. So we need to look at those opinions. The SEC has told us that it's not just a quantitative analysis. You can't just say, well, is my stock going to dip a certain percentage and it's just a financial issue? And so should a shareholder know about this from a dip in the stock? And the SEC has told us that it's also a qualitative analysis. Companies should be setting up, in my view, a matrix or some other process in which they have outlined all the different types of factors that could lead to material elements. For example, operational elements, reputational elements, regulatory risks, other types of risks that might lead to a qualitative analysis, if not quantitative. And I know that sounds a little fudgy, but that's what we're left with. And to be able to go through the process sometimes daily when you're dealing with a major incident, and be able to document where are we on our materiality scale. Do we believe that we have reached a materiality by examining each of the elements in our materiality matrix that we've created and then documenting that? If and when there is an enforcement action later that challenges why a company did not put out an 8K or otherwise a disclosure, there will be this document which shows that this was considered, that senior members, including disclosure counsel, were involved in this review, that these were the factors, and in hindsight, maybe it did become material. Well, we show that the thought process on that day was we were still able to function perfectly. We thought we were going to get this back from backups in a day and a half. If we did, no, this wouldn't have even been a little blip on our radar. And it turns out that those backups were corrupted 2 days later. And so it looks bad that we didn't do something earlier, but we had every reason to believe that we were going to be fine, right? So that process that's documented will be Exhibit A in a discussion with the SEC enforcement. And it's critical to document that, to have the process ready today. You don't want to create a process later. It will look like you're creating a process document that matches your incident to support yourself. So have a process document today in place, and then use that and go through and document your thinking throughout an incident.
Who, in your experience, who is the counsel of people who are actually able to make that determination? Is it legal plus CISO plus, I don't know, is there a, sometimes a governance council that's, interfunction, that kind of thing? Who's making those kind of determinations?
Yeah, Elizabeth, I think you nailed it with that last part. It's some sort of governance function, right? Certainly legal is going to be involved in a determination as to what the SEC law means and says. And so you need to involve legal. You're going to probably have a cyber counsel dealing with an incident, but you also need disclosure counsel. Often there will be an outside counsel involved. We see the outside incident response counsel and we see outside disclosure counsel, but it's not just them, right? It's the business. The business is deciding what the impact is. And so members of the business and of risk management need to sit there and really help evaluate what is the true impact of this, right? We can interpret the laws as much as we want, but if the business can tell us what's the actual impact of this, what's going to happen when this incident becomes public from a reputational perspective and what the street's going to think about this, what's going to happen with our clients and servicing our clients. What if a few of our branches have an issue if you're a bank, but others don't? How does that affect us overall, right? What's going to happen to confidence in us, especially in today's environment where confidence in banks might be waning with some of the news that we have, right? So it's all intertwined, and you've got to have. So I like having the business team involved, the communications or public relations team involved, the legal team, the CISO to talk about operational, and then risk, of course, that can help evaluate the risks involved.
It's almost like it's got to be a kind of add-on function to the rest of the incident response. It seems to me like it would be something that you would actually want to exercise as well, so that we're involved in all these exercises all the time. You want to know that function is working, right? That those people are at the table and can actually, are practiced at making the assessment, because it's an assessment that has to be constantly made on the fly as the incident progresses.
Oh, without a doubt. So look, from my perspective, it's worth sitting down and having this matrix. That's what we've created as a matrix, but we've worked with a lot of clients on that goes through the different factors and adjusts those factors per organization. It's not one size fits all by any stretch. Lists those out, asks questions under each factor, and then to your point, Elizabeth, let's exercise that. Let's think of the top 5 incidents a specific company could have and run them through that matrix on a day 1, day 2, day 3 scenario, and how that changes. Once we do that and we see the inputs from everyone, we'll have some muscle memory around that. Again, that'll be a great thing to tell the SEC if they're coming, because you've shown them that you've got that. It'll help refine the process for an actual incident. And look, it might lead to disclosure in an incident, or if it leads to no disclosure, it'll be an unbelievable way to document this in case of an examination or an enforcement action in the future.
All right, let's move on, because something we touched on in the beginning is the increasing board accountability, and what does cyber expertise on the board mean?
That is the million-dollar question. I wish I had an answer for that. And there's still a tremendous amount of debate in academia, inside organizations, and with regulators, right? If you demand a cyber expert, which has certainly been discussed and what the SEC wants disclosure of, if you demand a cyber expert, are you really creating one board member who's going to be looked upon by all other board members who will be reviewing all cyber, right? So is it a board of one at the end of the day? And that's a real problem. That we don't want a board of one. We want many great opinions, which is why I thought the New York Department of Financial Services proposal, which is to say that you either need an expert or expertise on the board, or you need the board to be advised by an expert. And I like that part. To be advised by an expert makes sense. And if you are advised by an expert, and I think it's an independent expert is what they mean, and that question was set to the department, then you can get some external independent expert advising the board, telling them, look, here's what you should be thinking through when you're thinking about cybersecurity. Here are the issues that you might face. Here's what you want to ask your CISO and other functions in the business about how they're ingesting cyber. And you can provide some really strong guidance. And that's what an oversight, right? And that's what we need. And we need to watch out between guidance and oversight and management. And I think that the regulators are straying a little bit, maybe a lot, by putting the board into too much of a management role as opposed to an oversight role. But we do know that whether we say that they've strayed into management as opposed to oversight, we know that the expectations have changed. What was fine for board briefing and management boards a year ago, 2 years ago, is not fine today. If, for example, the boards were getting one yearly presentation, which is what the New York Department of Financial Services technically required a year ago, we knew even last year that they thought that that was the floor, that they thought that a yearly presentation to the full board was absolutely the floor, and there were more presentations coming. And I know for a lot of institutions that includes a dashboard or a briefing to the audit committee or a risk committee. Some have a technology or cyber committee. And so it has included some sort of briefing for them. But ultimately, I think what we're seeing is that there's a greater requirement now, if not requirement, then expectation now by regulators that the full board is getting education from external experts, right? I think that it's often, and we're seeing clients talk about a kind of a technical cyber expert, and then they're bringing in people like us, lawyers, to provide some advice on what we're seeing from incidents, from regulators, providing some education. So there's an education about regulations and expectations of the board. There's an education on incidents and what other companies are doing. So there's that benchmarking element. And then there's a technical individual who's coming in and talking about how companies are evolving on the technology landscape, and even taking a look and providing advice. And this is where an externally led risk assessment or audit can provide advice on where the company individually stands and those controls stand. That is what I think protects against all of these requirements about board oversight, and will provide the board an ability to have meaningful oversight of cyber. And I think the reason that we actually do need some more of that is because too often boards will look at CISOs and say, wow, thank goodness you're here. You're really smart. You know what you're doing. Let us know if there's a problem. But they're not, because they're not cyber experts, they feel that they can't ask some tough questions. Respectfully, I think that board members, and I mean this, of course, respectfully, they're super smart. And they're super experienced, and they can ask questions even if they don't have cyber expertise. For example, I like hearing boards ask the question, what didn't we do this year? And why didn't we do this? What did you want on your budget, and what didn't you get on your budget? Who made the decision to take it off your budget? What's on your budget for next year? And why isn't there more on your budget, right? So just the same kind of questions that they're evaluating risk management for other functions, they can essentially have the CISO and the technology team provide their own thought process as to where they drew the line and what risks they were taking and willing to take. Because most companies are not spending what JP Morgan is spending on cybersecurity, right? Most financial services institutions, they just can't. And so why have they made a decision that they shouldn't be spending $500 million or $1 billion? Why have they decided to only spend, a tenth of that? And what elements does that mean they've left off the table? I think the board can simply ask questions along those lines and get some really deep insight into the risk management that the technology teams are taking.
So are these regulations asking that the board, are they simply asking to demonstrate exactly what you just laid out, that we have briefings X amount of times, that we have outside experts, that we have, or are they actually, is there some other level at which they would have to demonstrate the expertise?
We have not seen what exactly it means to demonstrate the expertise. We have seen some additional potential reporting to them, right? New York Department of Financial Services wants us to send the cybersecurity policy of an organization to the board. They want the C-suite, the CEO, to sign off and certify about compliance, so escalating those elements. There's discussion about a material gap found through vulnerability scanning being escalated potentially to the board, if not just to the CEO. And I do ask on those, what do we expect a senior management individual to do with a learning of a material gap in a vulnerability scan? There's no answer about that, but you can imagine that if you're being told that this is coming to you and you are more than rubber stamping, and of course boards are not there to rubber stamp anything, then that places a real onus on learning what that means in education, on follow-up and requesting follow-up information. And I think that is the expectation that the regulators have. They want to see that follow-up on critical and material issues getting escalated to the board and some pushback that comes from that.
Let's talk about, it sounds to me like all regulation seems to more or less be moving in the same direction. More. But is there any difference in regulatory approaches around the world that, could put a firm in kind of conflict with itself over different competing regulations that it now has to abide by?
Great question. My favorite example for that is actually employee monitoring, right? So the insider risk is very high on information security risks, even though in today's day and age we hear so much about ransomware, but still the insider risk is of critical importance. And we absolutely see a difference of approach with respect to employee monitoring, with Europe being extremely strong on the rights of individuals not to be monitored, including on their work computer, especially, for example, in Germany, where that's just unheard of, right? And in the US, you're allowed to do that, for example, both based on privacy regulations and if you're doing it for the purpose of cybersecurity protections, you're monitoring the individual for cybersecurity protections. There's actually clauses in the CISA Act, not the organization, but the CISA Act, which allows you to monitor for cybersecurity purposes and would trump the privacy laws with respect to that. So there's a big conflict there, right? Including the fact that you've got financial service regulations, for example, New York Department of Financial Services Cybersecurity Part 500, which talks about ensuring that you're monitoring for insider risks and you've got insider monitoring tools in place. And that seems to be very much in conflict with privacy laws with respect to not monitoring the individuals and the level of monitoring. And so I think that's one of the most fascinating areas where you're literally pitting one regulation against another. I think we see some of that as well in data retention laws. Privacy purposes, you want to minimize your data retention. Sometimes you've got SEC laws, for example, that require some data retention, and then you've got overall log security that you want to retain. So how much data retention are you doing? When do you minimize? Of course, it's nice to minimize the data so when the hackers get in, you don't have data that you no longer need and shouldn't have on your services, and it's stolen, and that looks really bad. And of course, we've heard of some very public incidents in the past in which that has occurred. but very difficult to navigate some of these regulatory schemes. And of course, we don't have the best harmonization around the world. So more to come, I think, with respect to where that goes. But privacy versus security in the European realm, I think, is one of the most interesting for employee monitoring.
All right, well, let's talk about harmonization since we've mentioned it a couple of times. There's obviously a bunch of different pushes. Like one I know is like the Cyber Risk Institute profile. There's pushes to try to get, at least from an examination standpoint, some kind of benchmark of, and there's NIST, and so that you're not, doing a zillion different kinds of questionnaires and everything like that for different regulators. But beyond that, I mean, where are we in terms of regulatory harmonization? Are the agencies themselves talking to each other, trying to be like, okay, well, this goes against that, so maybe we could both do this, so that at least firm X that's regulated by both of us has one directive, or is that not really happening?
It's great. We've got some great language coming out, right? The National Cyber Strategy from the administration talks about regulatory harmonization. It talks about not wanting our CISOs tied up in examinations all the time. And we've heard regulators talking about the importance of that. And yet, what was it, 2 weeks or 3 weeks after the president puts out our new cyber strategy, the SEC puts out 4 different proposed regulations and has differing notification requirements and overlapping and non-overlapping notification requirements. That doesn't seem very harmonized in its own agency, let alone among other organizations. But these are just proposals, and the industry is pushing back. And we've got the president's strategy saying, let's harmonize. So I do think that there is hope out there, but we need a lot of action behind that hope. The CIRCIA, right, the Critical Infrastructure Reporting Act, has set DHS up as a place to really try and achieve harmonization around reporting. I think we have seen some really great roundtables, discussions in the CISO circles and the legal circles with DHS to talk about the implementation of that. And organizations in the financial services world, but also in other sectors, had a chance to opine. And I think one of the elements that was constantly discussed was certainly harmonization and how we can harmonize the reporting requirements. I think the Financial Stability Board came out with a wonderful document, I think it was a month or 2 ago, which summarized where we can find some harmonization around incident reporting. Credit to the FSB, which is, of course, a group of our financial services regulators, thinking through this in a very thoughtful way and putting out that guidance. If the regulators now take that back and start thinking through that, I think that we're going to achieve some progress. We still need to beat the drum a little more and explain why it is that if 5 different regulators are asking for reporting on a single incident, for example, and doing examinations, why that's actually bad for cybersecurity, right? Why you end up having a CISO and her staff sitting down during an incident and focusing on examinations as opposed to, or reporting as opposed to actually security. And the examinations, regulators can say what they want, but they're always going to get attention of the senior executives, understandably so, right? And that means that attention has been diverted from operational resilience and other elements of actually protecting the enterprise. And so especially with duplication, that's bad. I think you mentioned the Cyber Risk Institute profile. That's such a fantastic tool, and I give such credit to that organization and Josh Magri for all the work that they've done. I do know that some of the financial services regulators have bought into that and have looked at that as a way of conducting examinations or accepting answers from that. I think that's a fantastic way forward if we can get some more buy-in on that side. And I think that's also a great tool for that group that we talked about in the beginning of who's involved in cyber incident materiality discussions and who's involved in governance. Sit around that matrix that has been filled out. I'm sorry, not the matrix I was talking about materiality, but the table that's part of the cyber risk profile. Review how all of the compliance elements fit in with the regulations. That's just a great conversation for all the teams to have together.
Is that when you say, because I was going to ask, given all of this, and given what you just mentioned about, how much time is being spent by senior executives on compliance, is there a way of structuring this to minimize, especially given the talent shortage that we have, to minimize the time spent, but maximize the effectiveness and efficiency of complying with all these regulations?
Well, that's a great question, and a lot smarter people than me have been giving that thought. I think we can go back to the profile, the cyber risk profile, and say that that's a way to do that. Because if that's being done and completed, then that answer sheet can be the starting point for a regulator to do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we should be utilizing a little more standardized questions almost. There's also been discussions about one agency that takes in reporting or understands all of it together, and then they distribute out maybe reports to all relevant agencies, and so it's a single source of contact for a financial services institution or any institution in reporting cyber incidents. So actually, one of my students
that seems unlikely.
It's extremely unlikely, but it's hopeful. I have a student from my cyber incident response law class that I teach who wrote a paper on this that I'm about to grade today. So if it's an A+, it'll be some great model we can all think through. So it is. I agree, it's unlikely, but I like that as a model. It would be so helpful for companies if there was an easier way to deal with this.
All right. What else have I missed that you think, if anything, CISOs and cyber teams need to understand in thinking about the changing regulatory landscape as it moves forward in the next 12 to 24 months?
I think we touched upon this a little earlier, but it's the team sport aspect. Right? The cybersecurity strategy is not just about, of course, it's not just about blocking and tackling and the security controls. It's about all of this put together now and creating a cyber committee that will include a business member, communications, legal, compliance, risk, as an example, right? Privacy, there will be others that are involved in that. Think through compliance, think through the strategy, right? And the processes that go around with all of that. I think that's the way forward here. A few years ago, we didn't really see cyber counsel. Just 7-8 years ago, there wasn't really a true cyber counsel in an organization. Now organizations have a team of cyber counsel, certainly in the financial services world. We didn't really see compliance people then, right? There were so many subject matter experts on the information security side and on the risk side, and then you had cyber lawyers coming in. There wasn't really a built-out compliance function in cybersecurity. That's changing now. Companies have a true SME for cybersecurity in their compliance department. I think there's no way around the fact that we need that. We need not just one SME, but a few, because there is a reason compliance functions know how to track issues and to test them, right? Both compliance review and compliance testing. And with all these regulations and certifications, et cetera, out there, having a process around that and bringing the expertise of compliance functions to bear on this, really important. And then, as I said, all working together and figuring out the right cadence for escalating, because that's not very easy, and that's where we've seen some mistakes. We talked about First American Title, Black Baud, enforcement action is another example of that. So we need, I think, more escalation, but at the right cadence.
Thanks again to Erez for being our guest on this episode. Based on our conversation, I'll leave you with a quote on the nature of regulation. The future is an ever-shifting maze of possibilities until it becomes the present. That's by fantasy writer Terry Brooks. If you like this podcast and want to hear from more FinCyber leaders around the world, subscribe to FinCyber Today on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also find them as well as articles by other thought leaders at FS-ISAC.com/insights, and also follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter. Thanks for listening, and I hope you learned something.